The question that lies dormant within consciousness itself, not born of modern confusion, but endemic to the very structure of being, takes its most refined form in the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, the Thrice-Greatest, the master of masters, the keeper of correspondence between worlds. Yet this figure is not primarily a historical personage, nor is he merely a symbolic repository of antiquated wisdom. Rather, he represents the eternal problem of consciousness, how the principle of mind bridges the infinite divide between transcendence and materiality, between the divine and the earthly, between that which cannot be named and that which must be known. The emergence of Hermes Trismegistus in the intellectual currents of Hellenistic Alexandria was no accident of syncretism. It was, instead, the inevitable crystallization of a metaphysical necessity. When Greek rational philosophy encountered Egyptian sacred knowledge, when Neoplatonic emanation met Kabbalistic descent, when the Logos of Athens confronted the mysteries of the Nile, something unprecedented occurred: the formulation of a coherent doctrine of universal correspondence. This was not mere blending, this was recognition. The Hermetic texts, those extraordinary documents that emerged from Alexandria between the 2nd and 4th centuries, do not invite belief. They posit structure. They assert that the universe operates according to an immutable architecture, in which every scale, every dimension, every order of being resonates with every other, according to principles so fundamental that they precede morality, precede emotion, precede the illusions of personal transformation. The declaration, as above, so below, as below, so above, is not poetry. It is a statement of ontological fact, a description of how consciousness itself is necessarily constituted. The problem that Hermes Trismegistus addresses, therefore, is not psychological. It is not about healing the wounded self or perfecting the moral will. It is about the structure of consciousness itself. How does the individual mind, bound within the prison of temporal existence and material embodiment, come to recognize, and more radically to embody, the eternal principles that govern all that is? How does the soul, shattered into multiplicity, by descent into the worlds of form, reunite itself with its source? And how does this reintegration occur not through belief, not through practice, but through the precise alignment of the inner architecture with the order above? This question echoes through the Gnostic cosmologies that flourished in the same matrix as Hermetic teaching. It sounds in the echoing chambers of early Kabbalah, where the descent of the Shekinah and the ascent of the righteous consciousness describe the same paradoxical movement. It reverberates through the Neoplatonic philosophy of Plotinus, where the soul's emanation from the One and its potential return to that source became the central metaphysical drama. Hermes Trismegistus did not invent these doctrines. He distilled them into a coherent science of inner transformation. Not transformation of the self, but transformation of the individual's conscious relation to universal law. The fundamental premise that underlies all authentic Hermetic teaching is this: true reorientation of the soul is not moral, emotional, or ideological in its nature. It is structural. It concerns the precise rearrangement of the inner principles of the human microcosm so that they align with the macrocosmic order. It is an inversion, not of values, but of the very center of consciousness itself. And this inversion can only occur through silence, through the collapse of former meanings, and through the patient construction of an inner temple that mirrors, stone by stone, the architecture of the eternal worlds. To understand Hermes Trismegistus is first to perceive the structure upon which all Hermetic knowledge rests, the eternal triad. Not as metaphor, not as pedagogical convenience, but as the fundamental principle of manifestation itself. The Thrice-Greatest does not derive his title from mere repetition of excellence. It emerges from his mastery of the threefold wisdom that governs all existence. The threefold system operates simultaneously across multiple registers, each corresponding to a different order of being and a different mode of consciousness. To trace this structure is to enter the skeleton upon which all visible reality hangs. The first manifestation of the triad appears in the structure of the soul itself, that mysterious principle which mediates between the eternal and the temporal. In the Hermetic anatomy, the soul unfolds in three distinct operations, each one constituting a different order of awareness and capacity. The lowest order, connected to the body and the sensory apparatus, operates through desire and appetite. It is the principle through which consciousness tastes the world of becoming, feels the weight of materiality, experiences the perpetual hunger that characterizes embodied existence. This is not evil, it is essential. Without this order of soul, consciousness could never enter manifestation at all. But above this lies a second order, the seat of imagination, of will, of the capacity to move between sensation and pure intellection. This middle soul is the realm of moral capacity, of choice, of the potential for self-deception or self-awakening. Here, between the gravitational pull of matter below and the luminous drawing of spirit above, the drama of the human condition is actually played out. The Hermetic teaching distinguishes this principle with precision. It is neither purely material nor purely spiritual, but participates in both natures, and therefore becomes the crucial site where transformation must necessarily occur. Above both of these stands the third order, the highest principle of the soul, sometimes called in the Hermetic texts the divine intellect, sometimes the voice of God within consciousness. This is not the individual mind. It is that which is wholly unified with the eternal, that which never descended, that which remains eternally rooted in the divine source from which the soul itself emanated. The function of this order is not to act or to choose, but to know with a knowledge that transcends all discrimination and returns the soul perpetually to its origin. These three orders of the soul correspond exactly to the three worlds that the Hermetic doctrine describes. The material world, the world of becoming, of bodies, of temporal succession, is the domain of the lowest soul operation. Here, consciousness experiences itself as trapped in flesh, bound by the laws of physics, subject to time's erosion. The psychical world, or as it might be termed, the world of the celestial spheres and archetypal forms, is the realm in which the middle soul operates. Here laws are still operative, but they are no longer primarily physical. They are imaginal, emotional, archetypal. The soul here dwells among living symbols and breathing universals, but above these stands the intelligible world, the realm of pure nous, pure knowing consciousness itself. It is here that the highest soul principle operates, and here all knowledge becomes identical with being. There is no knower separate from known. There is only the eternal recognition of what always is. This world does not emerge from any prior principle. All emergence flows downward from it. These three worlds, in turn, correspond to what the Hermetic texts call the three fires, not fires of passion, but three orders of force or creative potency. The first is the fire of passion, of desire, of the vital heat by which the body sustains itself, and the lower soul perpetuates its involvement with the sensory realm. The second is the fire of intellection, the burning clarity of the discriminating mind, the fire by which the middle soul separates truth from falsehood and orders the chaos of experience into meaningful pattern. The third fire is what might be called the divine flame, the creative fire from which all proceeds, the unquenchable radiance in which all opposites are consumed and unified. Furthermore, these structures translate into three modes of consciousness that the aspirant must come to recognize. The first mode is consciousness immersed, unreflective, wholly identified with the body and its appetites. It is consciousness as the world experiences it, fragmented, reactive, driven by exterior stimuli. The second mode is consciousness beginning to reflect upon itself, to create distance between the observer and the observed, to exercise will and imagination. This is the consciousness of the beginning student, the consciousness that has begun to recognize itself as separate from the merely physical, yet still struggles with the illusion of separation. The third mode is consciousness transparent to itself, no longer observing from within time and multiplicity, but knowing itself as the eternal knowing through which all manifestation flows. The Hermetic science, understood truly, is not a system of beliefs to be adopted, nor a set of practices to be executed. It is the precise articulation of these structures in language, so that consciousness itself, by contemplating the structure, begins to recognize its own true nature. Hermes Trismegistus is master of masters, precisely because he understood that true wisdom consists not in accumulation of knowledge, but in alignment. The soul must recognize its threefold nature. The mind must perceive the correspondence between its own structure and the structure of the cosmos. The will must become so attuned to the laws that govern universal manifestation that it ceases to exist as a separate force and becomes instead the instrument through which those eternal laws fulfill themselves in the world of time. This is the disposition of the genuine adept, not the cultivator of special experiences, not the accumulator of mystical states, but the one who has learned to stand in silence within the structure. Silence, because all speech, all conceptualization, all deliberate effort falls short of what must be known. Structure, because only the precise alignment of the inner principles with universal law creates the conditions in which authentic reorientation can occur. Doubt, not as skepticism or denial, but as the perpetual purification of the mind of false certainties, false concepts, the accumulated debris of assumption and belief that obscures the perception of what simply is. To speak of Hermetic initiation is not to speak of a program undertaken for self-improvement or spiritual enhancement. It is to describe the inevitable process through which consciousness, having become isolated and fragmented in its descent into matter, must necessarily travel if it is to recover its wholeness. This journey is not optional. For those who perceive the problem of their own condition, it becomes inescapable, and its movement occurs in distinct phases, each one possessing its own necessity, its own logic, its own particular terror and significance. The first phase must be understood as the descent and disillusionment. Before anything can be reoriented, consciousness must first fully acknowledge the depth of its entanglement with the world of multiplicity and form. The aspirant who comes to Hermetic knowledge does not typically do so from a position of contentment. Something in the experience of ordinary consciousness has become intolerable, not in the sense of mere emotional dissatisfaction, but in the sense of a fundamental recognition that the ground upon which the ordinary life is built is unstable, illusory, fundamentally at odds with something in the deeper nature of consciousness itself. This recognition, when it first comes, often appears as a disillusionment with the promises and structures of the world. The aspirant notices that the accumulation of possessions does not satisfy. That achievement of status does not produce lasting fulfillment. That the satisfactions of sensory pleasure are fleeting and empty. That the meanings upon which society rests, the narratives of progress, of personal gain, of individual striving, are revealed as phantoms when examined with any genuine attention. This is not depression or pathological pessimism. It is rather the beginning of the perception of reality itself. But deeper still, this descent into disillusionment must extend into the realm of the psyche, into the fundamental assumptions about the nature of the self. The aspirant begins to recognize that the I, which he has assumed to be the unified author of his actions, is itself a fragmentary construction, that consciousness is perpetually divided against itself, that the will is weaker than the very mechanisms it imagines it controls. The body has its desires, the emotions have their own logic. The intellect pursues its arguments with utter indifference to the welfare of the whole being. Where is the unified I that supposedly orchestrates all of this? This phase of descent and disillusionment has a symbolic function that must be understood. It is the soul recognizing the actual conditions of its imprisonment. Without this clear perception of bondage, no authentic yearning for liberation can arise. The comfort of illusion must be shattered before the true work can begin. In the Hermetic texts, this phase is associated with the operation of Saturn, the principle of limitation, of hard matter, of time's pitiless erasure. The consciousness that descends into genuine confrontation with the material nature of existence is descending into the domain of Saturn, the boundary maker, the separator, the principle that says, thus far and no further. From this descent must arise the second phase, confrontation and dissolution. Here the soul faces the actuality of its condition without the cushion of hope or the anesthesia of distraction. This is the phase of the ordeal, though not an ordeal imposed from without, but discovered within. For as consciousness begins to perceive the actual structure of its bondage, It must also come to recognize the forces that perpetuate that bondage, forces that are not external enemies, but expressions of the soul's own lower principles in their misdirected operation. In the Hermetic framework, this confrontation takes the form of direct encounter with what might be called the guardian demons, not external entities, but the autonomous complexes of the psyche that have developed their own apparent consciousness, their own desires, their own will to perpetuation. The appetite seeks to perpetuate itself through ever-intensifying stimulation. The emotional nature generates protective narratives, defensive postures, habitual reactions designed to shield itself from the unbearable truth of its own vulnerability. The intellect, untempered by wisdom, creates elaborate philosophical and spiritual frameworks that simply give new names to the old imprisonment. The confrontation with these forces is not a struggle in any literal sense. The soul cannot overcome them through effort or will, because effort and will remain the domain of the same forces that perpetuate the bondage. Rather, the confrontation is an unflinching perception. The soul, having begun to awaken to its true nature, simply observes, with increasing clarity and without reactivity, the exact mechanisms through which it maintains its own captivity. It sees with crystalline precision how it clings, how it grasps, how it creates meaning around meaninglessness, how it constructs an entire inner world for the purpose of avoiding the abyss of naked existence. This is the phase traditionally called the descent into the underworld, the descent into Hades or the Amenti. Psychologically, it corresponds to what Jung called the encounter with the shadow, though this term, understood hermetically, must be vastly deepened. For the shadow is not merely the repressed darkness of the individual psyche, it is the consciousness of bondage itself, the totality of the lower operations of the soul seen in their naked reality, stripped of all justifying narratives. As this confrontation deepens, consciousness moves into a state of extraordinary dissolution. The meanings that held the personality together begin to fragment. The narratives that gave coherence to identity begin to crack. The boundaries that separated the I from the world, that seemed so solid, so absolutely real, appear as gossamer thin constructions on the verge of collapse. Yet the soul does not retreat from this dissolution. Instead, it deepens into it, because the perception of the illusory nature of the constructed self is also the perception of something else, something that observes the dissolution without being dissolved, that perceives the crumbling of the false without identifying with it. This brings us to the third phase, the most critical and the most difficult to articulate, the abyss and suspension between worlds. This is the phase in which the soul arrives at what might be called the zero point of transformation. All that was known is gone. All that was certain has proven false. The old consciousness, with its structures, its meanings, its comfortable imprisonment, has dissolved. But the new consciousness has not yet stabilized. The soul exists in a state of radical discontinuity, having lost reference to the world it has always inhabited, not yet integrated into the eternal order toward which it yearns. This is, in a sense, a condition of existential death. The person ceases, but there is not yet a new person. The ego has collapsed, but the self has not yet crystallized. The Hermetic texts speak of this as the crossing of the abyss, the great void that separates the realm of manifestation from the realm of pure being. In Kabbalistic terms, this is the abyss that lies between the supernal triad and the lower orders of manifestation. To cross it is to undergo a fundamental severance from all that is familiar, to stand, as it were, outside existence itself. What makes this phase transcendently significant is that it cannot be endured and cannot be escaped through any mechanism available to the ordinary consciousness. The will cannot bridge the abyss through effort. The intellect cannot cross it through understanding. The emotions cannot negotiate it through any transaction with the cosmic forces. The soul must pass through the abyss, and in doing so, it experiences something that has no name and no measure in the language of ordinary consciousness. It is not peace. Peace implies a state of being that can be experienced. It is not knowledge. Knowledge implies a duality between knower and known. It is the suspension of consciousness itself within the void. the maintenance of awareness without any object of awareness, the continuation of existence without any quality of experience that can be translated into human language. This phase is utterly necessary and utterly unavoidable for any consciousness that has begun the true journey. It is not pathological, it is metaphysically inevitable, it is the price of the genuine approach to the eternal. And it is here in this abyss that the greatest crisis of the spiritual journey must be addressed. For it is here that the soul is most vulnerable to the illusions of premature reintegration, to the acceptance of false visions, to the seduction of the lower realms pretending to be the divine. From this abyss, if it is survived and not all who enter it find their way across, emerges the fourth and final phase, reorientation and reascent. But this reorientation cannot be anticipated or prepared for. It cannot be guided by any prior understanding. It is the soul's own recognition of itself in the eternal light, not because anything new has been acquired, but because the false has been so thoroughly removed that what always was can finally be perceived. The abyss stands not at the beginning of the path, nor truly at its end, but rather at the center, at the middle point where the soul faces the naked nullity of its own constructed nature. To speak of this abyss is not to speak of an external obstacle or a stage to be passed through successfully. It is to confront the very threshold at which authentic initiation becomes possible and at which the soul's deepest illusions must be utterly dissolved. The loss of reference that characterizes this phase is absolute. The aspirant who reaches this point discovers that all the landmarks by which consciousness had previously oriented itself have vanished. The sense of a continuous self that persists through time, this evaporates. The assumption that the external world has a stable reality independent of perception, this collapses. The belief that the mind possesses any genuine agency, any true capacity to direct the course of existence, this is revealed as delusion. Even the higher aspirations that brought the seeker to this point, the longing for transcendence, the desire for wholeness, the yearning to know the eternal, these too must be recognized as constructions that emerge from and perpetuate the fragmentation they claim to resolve. What remains when all reference is lost? Not another reference point, not a deeper ground, not a more authentic self. What remains is the naked awareness that there is awareness itself, not aware of anything, not conscious of anything, but the awareness that awareness is. To arrive at this point is to have descended beyond the reach of every comforting narrative, every spiritual framework, every philosophical system that consciousness ordinarily employs to insulate itself from direct experience of its own void. The collapse of former meanings is not a gentle fading, it is a shattering. The personality that had constructed its existence upon particular meanings, the meaning of being successful, of being loved, of being spiritually advanced, of being special, or damned, or chosen, experiences these meanings not as forgotten, but as revealed to be hollow at their core. The words that once seemed to carry genuine significance become mere sounds. The narratives that structured reality become transparent fiction. And most crucially, the sense that the self to whom these meanings applied was ever a real entity becomes impossible to sustain. This is the existential silence that descends in the abyss. It is not the silence of peace, which would imply a state of contentment. It is the silence of absolute meaninglessness, in which even the concept of meaning itself has been suspended. The mind, confronted with this void, often generates extraordinary defenses against it. It may produce visions, invoke higher powers, construct elaborate philosophical arguments proving that the abyss is not real, or that beyond it lies some attainable perfection. But these are the final corruptions of consciousness, the last and most dangerous illusions. It is absolutely crucial to distinguish at this juncture between the initiatic crisis and pathological breakdown. The distinction is subtle but decisive. In pathological breakdown, consciousness is overwhelmed and fragmentized by forces it cannot contain. The ego structure shatters not through conscious confrontation with its illusory nature, but through trauma, shock, or psychological inability to maintain coherence. The result is a wounded consciousness, divided from itself, seeking desperately to reconstruct walls against further dissolution. The initiatic crisis, by contrast, arises from consciousness approaching the abyss with open awareness. The ego structure does not shatter through external shock, but through the soul's own recognition of its illusory nature. The shattering is not suffered as violation, but perceived as revelation. The consciousness that enters the abyss does so voluntarily, with full awareness that it is approaching something that cannot be survived by the ordinary self. And precisely because it approaches with consciousness, the dissolution it experiences has the quality of necessity rather than catastrophe. Yet the abyss makes no exceptions. Whether the descent is approached consciously or suffered unconsciously, whether the soul enters it willingly or is thrown into it against its will, the actual conditions of dissolution remain the same. The difference lies only in the capacity to maintain awareness within that dissolution, to sustain the consciousness that witnesses the destruction of itself without reactivity, without the desperate grasping at false support that converts initiation into pathology. The suspension between worlds that characterizes the experience of the abyss is, in fact, the most valuable moment of the entire journey. Here, separated from both the lower world of manifestation and not yet stabilized in the realm of the eternal, consciousness encounters itself without mediation. There is no world to distract it, no body to provide reference, no personality to justify existence. The soul, in its utter nakedness, faces directly what it is, and what it discovers in this confrontation is both paradoxical and absolute. There is no thing that can be called the soul apart from the eternal consciousness from which it emanates. There is no separate self that exists in distinction from the cosmic order. The very notion of individual consciousness, when examined in the abyss, dissolves into the perception of one universal consciousness, expressing itself through infinite modes. The personality that feared dissolution, that clung to identity, that sought to perpetuate its separate existence, this is revealed to have been always and already an illusion, a temporary eddy in an infinite stream, a wave mistaking itself for something separate from the ocean. This recognition is the teleological necessity of the abyss. It cannot be arrived at through any lesser means. The soul cannot be reasoned into this perception, cannot be guided there through technique or practice, cannot be given the experience through initiation by another. It must arrive at the abyss itself, must experience the complete dissolution of reference, must pass through the state in which all consolation is withdrawn and all hope is extinguished, precisely in order that it may perceive with absolute clarity that the hope for which it yearned was the seeking of itself, that the consolation for which it grasped was already ever present, and that the death it feared was the death of an illusion that never truly was. Without this suspension, without this radical break in the continuity of the constructed self, no genuine reorientation is possible. The soul would simply reproduce, at a subtler level, the same patterns of fragmentation and false seeking from which it thought to escape. The abyss exists precisely because it must. Its terror is its function, its meaninglessness is its truth. And only by remaining conscious, fully awake, unflinching within that abyss, can the soul pass through it and arrive at the other shore. When the soul emerges from the abyss of suspension between worlds, there is no return to what was. The consciousness that crosses the threshold is not enhanced, not perfected, not more luminous than before. Rather, it is fundamentally reoriented. The perspective from which it perceives reality has inverted. What seemed real now appears as shadow. What seemed impossible to know has become self-evident. But most importantly, the entire relationship between the individual consciousness and the cosmic order has undergone irreversible transformation. This reorientation, which Hermetic teaching calls the formation of the inner temple, is not the construction of something new. It is the revelation of what was always present beneath the false structures that consciousness had erected. In the moment when reference is completely lost, when all external anchors have been stripped away, consciousness recognizes its own nature directly. It perceives that which has never descended, that which remained eternally rooted in the divine source. And in that recognition, it awakens to its fundamental unity with the cosmic intelligence from which all manifestation flows. The inner temple, understood in this deepest sense, is not a construction undertaken by the individual will. It is the revelation of the essential structure of consciousness itself, now perceived clearly, because all the distortions that veiled it have been removed. The three orders of the soul, the lower, the middle, and the higher, are no longer experienced as three separate realms engaged in perpetual conflict. They are perceived as three differentiations of one consciousness, each operating according to its proper nature, each fulfilling its necessary function within the whole. The lowest order of soul, that which operates through the body and sensory apparatus, now functions with perfect clarity, liberated from the driven quality that characterized it before. The appetite operates without craving, because the illusion that satisfaction can come from any external object has been recognized and dissolved. The body continues as it must, but the consciousness inhabiting it no longer mistakes the body's impulses for the voice of truth. The desires that arise are perceived clearly, allowed their expression where they naturally flow, and released without the grasping quality that perpetuates suffering. The middle realm of soul, the domain of imagination, emotion, and will, is transformed by the clarity that consciousness now brings to it. The emotions, which had seemed so utterly real, so compelling, so authoritative when they overwhelmed consciousness from within, are now recognized as natural movements of the psychic realm, beautiful and terrible in their own right, but no longer mistaken for the voice of reality. The will, which had seemed so impotent when turned outward toward the world, discovers its authentic potency. It becomes the perfect instrument through which the eternal intelligence expresses itself in time. And imagination, which had been the slave of fear and desire, becomes the means through which the transcendent truth can be reflected into the realm of form. The highest principle, the divine intellect that dwells eternally in the intelligible world, is no longer experienced as external, as something to be reached or attained, but recognized as the very consciousness that was always present, even in the deepest phases of bondage. What is accomplished in the formation of the inner temple is that this eternal consciousness becomes operative in the temporal realm, not in the sense of spiritual experience or mystical states, but in the sense that the individual human consciousness has become transparent to its own eternal nature. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus emerges, in this context, as the symbol of the consciousness that has undergone complete reorientation. He is thrice great precisely because he embodies the perfection of the three orders of soul in their harmonious operation. He is the master of masters because he has recognized that mastery consists not in domination of external forces or even of the inner psyche, but in the perfect alignment of his individual consciousness with the universal intelligence that expresses itself through all dimensions of reality. How then does the consciousness that has undergone this reorientation express itself in the world? Not through the pursuit of extraordinary experiences, not through the cultivation of special powers, not through the accumulation of esoteric knowledge. Instead, it expresses itself through a profound restraint, a careful economy of action, a silence that has become the fundamental signature of authentic wisdom. The one who has been truly transformed acts with minimal disturbance. Every action is calculated to align with the necessary movements of the world, neither resisting what must occur nor hastening what will come in its season. The unnecessary is recognized and simply not undertaken. The forced is abandoned in favor of what flows naturally from genuine perception. There is an absence of the striving quality that characterizes the ordinary approach to life, because the consciousness that has crossed the abyss understands that what must come will come, and that the greatest power consists precisely in not interfering with the natural movements of universal intelligence. Speech, too, becomes rare and precious. The transformed consciousness speaks less, not from suppression or from some spiritual discipline of silence, but because speech becomes unnecessary, except where genuine truth has something to communicate through it. The words that are spoken carry weight, carry clarity, carry the unmistakable resonance of genuine knowledge. There is no elaboration, no explanation, no attempt to convince or persuade. The truth is stated in its essential form, and those whose ears can hear will understand. Others will not, and the consciousness that has truly reoriented itself has no investment in their understanding. But most significantly, the consciousness that has integrated itself through the threefold passage bears a greater responsibility than it ever bore before. This is not the responsibility of the ego, which shrinks from accountability and seeks always to justify itself. This is the responsibility of serving as a clear channel through which the eternal order can express itself in the temporal realm. Every act becomes significant precisely because it participates in the great work of the cosmos itself, the work of bringing the eternal into manifestation, of making the transcendent active in time, of serving as a living proof that the separation between divine and human, eternal and temporal, is appearance only. This inner architecture, once formed, is incorruptible. It cannot be destroyed by circumstance, cannot be shaken by the reversals of fortune, cannot be undermined by the loss of what the personal life valued most. The consciousness has been relocated to its true center, which is eternal and beyond the reach of time's erosions. All that remains exposed to the movements of the world is the personality, the body, the circumstances of the temporal existence. But the consciousness that inhabits these forms no longer identifies with them. It has recognized its own immortality, not as a future achievement or as eternal persistence of the personal, but as the eternal present in which it always stood, even when it imagined itself to be bound in time. The result of true transformation is not illumination, which would imply a dramatic enhancement of experience. It is alignment, the perfect correspondence between the individual consciousness and the universal order, so complete that there is no longer any division between the two. The individual acts, but it is the cosmic intelligence acting through the individual form. The individual speaks, but it is the eternal wisdom making itself heard through a human voice. The individual exists, but with the awareness that what exists is one life, one intelligence, one reality, manifesting itself through infinite individuals and dimensions, all united in the recognition of their essential unity. This is the formation of the inner temple, not a place that can be described, not an experience that can be recorded, not a state that can be sustained or lost. It is, rather, the permanent reorientation of consciousness to its own truth, the substitution of delusion with reality, the replacement of the endless seeking with the peace that comes from ceasing to seek what was never lost. The true mastery of Hermes Trismegistus is not found in the possession of secret knowledge or the performance of hidden operations, but in the demonstration that consciousness, when it has traversed the full arc of descent and reorientation, becomes the transparent instrument through which eternal order manifests itself in the world of time and form. What is not ordered within can never order anything without. What is not mastered in the soul cannot master anything in the world, and the kingdom that is built only in external works, without the reconstruction of the inner temple, is merely another Tower of Babel, destined to crumble before the first wind that awakens from the eternal silence.